Hi, this is Jean Braithwaite with a quick and dirty introduction to genre. If you're looking at this videotape, it's probably because you're a student in one of my creative writing classes at a university. So I'm going to take this from the perspective of an academic creative writing department first. In a creative writing program, typically 3 different genres will be taught: fiction, poetry, nonfiction. If you happen to be studying literature in a literature department instead, there might be another genre tossed in, drama, and for that reason, nonfiction is sometimes called the 4th genre, because in literary study there were these other 3 genres traditionally. Typically in a university class, you're either going to be an intro class, which combines usually these 3 genres, or you're going to be in an advanced class which focuses on just one of the 3. So here's how they break down. Particularly if you're in the introductory class, you may need to have a grasp of some of these basic terms. The world of literature is divided in 2 along this principle. Everything is either poetry or it's prose. And that's what prose sort of means, that it's not poetry. So if you can understand what poetry is, you already automatically understand what prose is. Let me show you a couple examples. Here's a textbook that I frequently use as a required book in a mixed genre class that I teach, because it has some of everything in it: fiction, poetry, and nonfiction. If you just open up to a random page, it's kind of easy to see which are the poems. In a poem like this one, the lines don't go all the way out to the side of the page. Contrast this to a page like this, where all the words do go all the way to the margin. This is a prose piece. The words are arranged into sentences and paragraphs, instead of, as in a poem, being arranged into lines, and we call these little chunks with the spaces between stanzas rather than paragraphs. So the first and most basic and obvious structural thing to notice about a poem is that it's this very deliberate arrangement of lines on the 2-dimensional space of the page by the poet, which you do not have in prose. In prose, it's more or less random where each line ends. It just happens to depend on where they set the margins when they were printing it. And the prose author does not care about the exact arrangement of every word on the page, the way the poet does. The careful arrangement of words into lines that end at a specific place is, of course, not the only thing that a poet is up to when they're making a poem. That's not the only thing that's going on and that makes poetry good poetry. But it's an easy and obvious diagnostic tool. If you're in a mixed genre class with me, sooner or later we'll talk about some more of these poetic elements. The way poets try to choose interesting words, words that are interesting as words, the way they might care about the sounds of words more than a prose author might, the way they might try to make their work very compressed and intense. At some point you may hear the term prose poem. That just means a poem that has all of those other qualities, but without necessarily bothering about where the lines start and end, and with the words arranged into paragraphs rather than stanzas. The world of prose is further subdivided into fiction and nonfiction. Again, one of these things is sort of defined in terms of not being the other, right? I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the way this went, actually. It's too late now. These are the terms that everybody uses, but if I could have been there at the beginning and done it differently, I would have made nonfiction be the basic thing and define fiction in terms of it. Because nonfiction is directly connected to the real world. Those things which are written about in nonfiction are claimed by the author to be a direct reflection of things as they actually are. The events that you read about in nonfiction are claimed actually to have happened. The people that you read about in nonfiction are claimed to actually exist as people in the real world. It's in fiction that you're allowed to make up stuff. Events that never happened, people that never existed, even worlds and places that never existed. Of course, when people write fiction, they're also commenting on the real world, much of the time anyway. But the way in which they're commenting it is more indirect. Now, it would be incredibly natural to think that that fiction-nonfiction distinction ought to apply across the board. That we have, on the one hand, the poetry-prose distinction, and that both of them subdivide into fiction and nonfiction, so that we could take a poem and ask about it. Is this something that really happened in the real world, or is it not? And talk about fictional and nonfictional poetry, just as we talk about fictional and nonfictional prose. That is very logical and natural to think that way, but by convention, we do not. There's not a four-way distinction, there's only a three-way distinction. Poetry over here, about which we never ask, fiction or nonfiction, and prose over here, about which we do. Nonfiction happens to be my particular academic specialty. That's what I got hired to teach. So of course I care about it very much and frequently teach nonfiction classes. All of the different genres have their subtypes within that genre. When we're talking about fiction, if it's a little short thing like a chapter in a book, we call that a short story. If it's the whole book is one piece of fiction, we call that a novel. Do not use the word novel to refer to any type of nonfiction book. That is a mistake. If you use the word novel in that way, people will realize you do not understand about genre. In the category of nonfiction, if it's a short piece, we generally call it an essay. If it's book length, there are a wide variety of different things it could be called depending on what type of thing it is. There's not a nice overarching term like novel in the case of nonfiction. If you're wanting to be sort of general about it, you would have to say book length nonfiction, or possibly book length narrative nonfiction, if in fact it is a narrative. In every kind of creative writing course I teach, one of my objectives is always to show a wide variety of different examples of the genre that I'm teaching, or the genres. So we'll continue to talk more about various different subtypes as we go along. Now I want to say a couple of words about a phrase that you often see in the movies, based on a true story. I hate that phrase. Based on a true story is a license to lie. When they say based on, they're not claiming that everything they said to you is the actual truth. They've given themselves wiggle room so that what they're actually presenting to you is fiction. Fiction is often based on something that happened in the real world. Artists who write fiction get inspired by all kinds of real-world things. Claiming some kind of connection to the real world is not enough to make a piece of writing nonfiction. It has to be that direct relationship. There are degrees of how closely related fiction writing is to the actual world. Realistic fiction sticks pretty close. Fantasy fiction might be pretty far removed. It might contain magical events and people that never could exist, flying horses and things like that. You can argue, and I would argue, that no matter how far out there the fantasy gets, that there's still some kind of connection between your fictional fantasy world and the real world, if only because people read it looking for stuff that they can use to connect to the real world. Hopefully, the heroic emotions that are created in you when you're reading your favorite fantasy lend you a kind of courage that you can bring to your real life encounters, for instance. There is a lot more that could be said about genre than this quickie intro, but this is enough to get started with, and we will talk about it again as the semester progresses. Remember, the world divides into poetry and prose, depending on how it's laid out on the page. Of prose, we can further ask, did this really happen? And subdivide it into the two categories of fiction and nonfiction. The term novel applies to fiction only. It's book-length fiction, and short story is shorter than book-length fiction. People sometimes use the word story more vaguely and apply it also to nonfiction narratives, but in my class I'm going to ask you to be kind of careful to make this distinction and say that short stories are fiction, and when we talk about short nonfiction, we will call them essays. That's it for now. More to come.